In the middle of a summer heat wave, a wall of ice appeared in his ranch basement. What was hidden behind it was never meant to be seen. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The summer had arrived like an enemy army, advancing across the desert without mercy, laying siege to every living thing that dared to stand in its path. Heat shimmered above the cracked earth of Elias Carter's ranch, bending the horizon into wavering ghosts of itself, as if the land were trying to remember a time when it had not been burned raw. The wind carried dust instead of relief, a dry, suffocating breath that filled the nose and coated the tongue with the bitter taste of failure. By noon, the thermometer nailed to the porch post had climbed past 105, the red line stretching higher than Elias had ever seen it, and still the day was young. He stood in the shade of the house, though the word shade felt like a lie. The boards beneath the awning radiated warmth like the body of a feverish animal, and the sweat on his back dried almost as soon as it appeared. Elias wiped his brow with the sleeve of his faded work shirt and stared across the acreage that had once been green, once been his grandfather's pride. Now it was a patchwork of yellow stubble and naked soil, the kind that cracked open like broken pottery if you so much as looked at it wrong. He had turned 42 last winter, though his reflection in the darkened window made him look older. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep and permanent, carved there by years of squinting into sun and wind, of counting losses rather than profits. He had inherited the ranch from his father, who had inherited it from his own father, and each generation had added something, taken something away, and left behind a residue of stubborn hope that clung to the walls of the house like old paint. Elias had grown up here, learned to walk in these fields, learned to drive on the dirt track that led to the highway 10 miles away. He had sworn he would never leave it, even when the world beyond the ranch had changed so completely that the promise had begun to feel absurd. The bank did not care about promises. The envelopes stacked on the kitchen table were proof enough, their official logos peering up at him like silent judges. He had stopped opening them weeks ago, though he knew exactly what they contained. Late fees, warnings, final notices dressed up in polite language. The tractor had broken down in the spring, a cracked piston that he could not afford to replace, and the old pump at the well coughed and rattled whenever he forced it into service. The cattle had gone first, sold off in a slow parade of trailers that had left behind empty corrals and an echoing silence that settled into his bones. The price he got for them barely covered the feed he had already bought. He walked toward the barn, stepping over a length of hose that lay coiled like a dead snake in the dust. The barn door sagged on one hinge, and he had propped it open with a cinder block to keep it from slamming shut in the wind. Inside, the smell of hay had been replaced by the smell of nothing, which was somehow worse. He ran a hand along the wooden stall where his favorite mare had once slept, and felt the grain rough beneath his fingers. His grandfather had built this place with his own hands, so the stories went, hauling lumber in a borrowed truck and hammering nails until his fingers bled. Elias could still hear the old man's voice in the back of his head, telling him that land was like family, that it would give back what you put into it if you were patient enough. Patience was a luxury he could no longer afford. Every night he lay awake in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the highway and the closer creaks of the house settling into the soil, and tried to add numbers that refused to align. Even the small comforts were slipping away. He ate standing up more often than not, too tired to sit at the table where his mother had once served Sunday dinners. The phone rang rarely, and when it did it was either a wrong number or someone asking if he wanted to sell. It was not just the money. though that was the sharpest thorn. It was the sense that the place itself was given up on him. The well water tasted faintly metallic now, and the wind that funneled down from the north had an edge to it that had not been there in years past. He had noticed it first in the evenings when he stood at the back door and smoked, watching the sun sink behind the low hills. There was a draft there, a whisper of coolness that brushed the ankles and vanished before he could be sure it had existed at all. The house made noises at night. He had lived with its groans and sighs his entire life, but lately they had changed. Sometimes it sounded like a distant pop, a muted crack that set his teeth on edge. Once he had woken convinced he heard something breathing beneath the floorboards, a slow, labored rhythm that faded as he held his own breath to listen. He had told himself it was stress, that a man who lived alone long enough would start hearing ghosts in the walls. He had enough real problems without inventing imaginary ones. Still, he avoided the basement when he could. It was not fear exactly, but a kind of unease, as if the stairs led down not into the belly of his own house, but into something that had never quite belonged to it. That afternoon, the pump finally gave up. He heard it from the porch, a clattering cough that cut off mid-sputter, leaving behind a hollow silence that was somehow louder than any noise. He closed his eyes and counted to 5, then to 10, feeling the heat press in on him from every side. Without water, there would be no washing, no cooking, no hope of even the smallest repairs. He could not ignore it, no matter how much he wanted to. The basement door stuck as always, swollen in its frame, and he had to shoulder it open. A wave of stale air rolled up the stairs, carrying the scent of damp concrete and old oil. He hesitated on the top step, hand resting on the rail worn smooth by decades of palms, and listened. The house was too quiet, the desert outside holding its breath. Then, faintly, he felt it, a coolness that brushed his face and made the hairs on his arms prickle. It was impossible, he told himself, absurd in the middle of a summer like this. He took another step down, then another, his boots thudding softly against the wood. The light bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered when he pulled the chain, casting weak yellow circles across the familiar clutter of tools, boxes, and forgotten furniture. The pump sat in its corner like a sullen animal, and the air around it felt wrong. Not just cool, but sharp, as if he had walked into the shadow of a glacier instead of the heart of a dying ranch. Elias paused on the last step, every instinct urging him to turn around and go back up into the heat where things made sense. But he needed the water, and he needed to understand why the basement, of all places, felt like the mouth of winter. He shifted the flashlight in his hand and swept the beam across the room toward the north wall where his grandfather had once etched the height of Elias's childhood years in pencil. The light caught on something there, something pale and unnatural, and for a moment he thought his eyes were betraying him. Then the beam steadied, and the truth stood before him, silent and impossible, breathing cold into the ruins of his life. For several seconds, Elias did not move. He stood with one boot on the concrete floor and one still on the last wooden step, as if his body had not yet decided which world it belonged to. Behind him, the heat of the day pressed at the basement door like a living thing, trying to seep down the stairwell in waves, but it stopped short of the air that filled this place. The cold in the cellar was not the gentle coolness of shade or stone. It was a hard, biting presence that seemed to sharpen the edges of every object it touched. It made the breath in his lungs feel thin and brittle, as though he were inhaling winter itself. The flashlight beam slid across the north foundation wall and revealed what his mind kept refusing to accept. A massive sheet of ice had formed there, spanning almost the entire width of the wall from one corner to the other, rising from the floor to a height above his shoulders. It did not look like a glaze or a harmless layer of frost. It looked like a frozen lake had been lifted and pressed against the concrete. The surface was thick and uneven, cloudy in places, clear in others, with trapped bubbles that seemed suspended mid-motion. Hairline veins ran through it like cracks in old glass. In the weak basement light, those veins caught and scattered the beam, creating the illusion of depth, of something alive beneath the frozen skin. Elias took a step forward, then another, the soles of his boots scraping over gritty concrete. The closer he got, the more his skin protested. The air around the wall felt denser, as if the cold had weight. His arms prickled under the short sleeves of his shirt. He could see his own breath now, pale wisps that curled away from his mouth and dissolved. It was ridiculous. He could not remember a summer when the ground itself did not radiate stored heat through the night. Even in winter, this place rarely got truly cold. The desert did not do ice like this, not in July and not on a basement wall. If a neighbor had told him they'd found a glacier in their cellar, he would have laughed. Or worse, he would have looked at them with the sad understanding reserved for people who had begun to lose their grip. Yet, here it was, silent and solid, occupying the wall like a verdict. He crouched near the edge of the sheet where ice met concrete. The boundary was rough, as though the ice had grown outward, gripping the wall in a slow, relentless creep. There were tiny stalactites along the bottom lip where moisture had once dripped and frozen in mid-fall. The floor beneath it was slick with a skin of frost. When he placed the flashlight on the ground to free his hands, the metal casing immediately began to dull with a faint white haze. His mind ran through explanations the way it ran through bills at night, desperate to find a number that would make sense. A broken pipe? But there was no plumbing in that wall, not that he remembered, and besides, frozen water would not make the air burn like this. An old refrigeration unit? The house was too old for anything like that, too simple, built by hands that trusted sweat and wood rather than machines. Some kind of underground spring that chilled the stone? In this desert. The thought was almost insulting. The only springs out here were the ones men had dug themselves, and those had long since run dry. Still, he could not deny the physical evidence. His fingertips tingled even through his gloves as he hovered them close. The cold was aggressive, not merely the absence of heat, but something that seemed to attack warmth. He pulled off one glove and, before he could overthink it, pressed his bare palm against the ice. Pain flared instantly, sharp enough to make his vision spark. It was not the slow ache of holding snow too long, not the numb crawl of frostbite. It felt like a burn, as if his skin had been slapped against metal that had sat in a freezer for days. He yanked his hand back and sucked in a breath, seeing the pale red imprint of his palm, the skin already swelling in tight, angry lines. "Jesus," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the cold. He wrapped his hand again and stood, breathing hard. That single touch had made the problem real in a way sight could not. This was not some trick of the light. Whatever was happening here could hurt him, and if it could hurt him, it could hurt the house. He turned his gaze to the rest of the basement and noticed details that had not seemed strange until now. A thin rime of frost had formed on the nearest shelves, outlining the edges of old paint cans and jars of nails. The wooden posts that held up the ceiling were damp and glistening on the side facing the wall, as if moisture in the air had condensed there and frozen in a slow, steady cycle. The cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall had a faint sheen, corners stiffened by cold. The basement felt divided into two climates. On the far side, near the stairs, it was merely cool and stale. Closer to the north wall, it became a different place altogether, an environment that did not belong under a house in the desert. Elias found himself thinking of stories his grandfather had told about the high country in winter, about nights when the cold could split rocks. As a boy, he had listened with wide eyes, unable to imagine a world where air could be that cruel. Now, standing here, he felt the old stories settle into his bones as if they had been waiting for this moment. Outside, the sun still scorched the land. He could almost hear it through the walls, a distant roar of heat. The contradiction made his stomach clench. He pictured the ranch as he'd seen it that morning. Shimmering horizon, dust devils skipping across the field, the porch boards too hot to touch with bare feet. Nothing about that world should have produced what he saw here. The cold on this wall was not a natural counterbalance. It was an intrusion, an infection. He forced himself to inspect the wall more closely. The ice did not merely cover the surface, it seemed fused into it. When he angled the flashlight to catch the side, he saw subtle bulges where the concrete beneath had fractured and pushed outward. There were faint lines in the masonry, cracks that radiated away from the center like stress fractures in a windshield. The foundation, which had held for decades, looked suddenly fragile, as if it had been placed under a pressure it was never meant to withstand. A new sound pricked his ears, soft but distinct. Somewhere within the wall, behind the ice, there was a faint popping, a tiny crack that echoed through the concrete and disappeared. He froze, listening. Another sound followed, not a pop this time, but something like a whisper, a hiss so quiet he might have imagined it if the hairs on his arms had not lifted again. He stepped back, heart beating harder than it should have for a man simply standing in his own basement. The pump, forgotten for the moment, seemed small and irrelevant now. Water could wait another hour. If the foundation was failing, if something behind that wall was producing this cold, then the house, his last asset, his last shelter, his last link to the men who built it, was at risk. He tried to think like the practical man he had been forced to become. He thought of calling someone, but who? The county office would take one look at his finances and treat the problem like a future foreclosure they didn't mind accelerating. A neighbor might come, but what would he say? That his basement wall had turned into an ice shelf? Even if someone believed him, the solutions that followed would not be free. Nothing was free anymore, not for him. His mind wandered unwillingly to the fantasy that had tempted him in darker nights, that something under the ranch might save him. A hidden cistern, a forgotten cache, anything that could be sold, used, leveraged. The desert had eaten away at his hopes, but a man like Elias still carried the reflex to look for a way out. As he stared at the ice, he felt that reflex awaken, tangled with fear. If there was a cause, there was a source. If there was a source, there was something behind the wall. And if there was something behind the wall, it might explain more than just the cold. It might explain the strange drafts, the noises at night, the way the ground near the north side sometimes felt firmer underfoot even after rains. He knew what he should do. Leave it alone and call professionals. But he also knew what his bank balance looked like, and he knew the house groaned more each month under the strain of age and neglect. If the wall was being destroyed, waiting would not stop it. Waiting might ensure the damage became irreparable. He imagined the north corner collapsing, the floor above buckling, his grandfather's pencil marks on the wall disappearing under rubble. The thought made his throat tighten in a way he did not want to examine. He went back up the stairs, each step carrying him into warmer air, and pushed the basement door open. The heat that slammed into his face felt obscene after the cold below. It was like stepping from a freezer into an oven. The sunlight on the porch was blinding. For a moment, he stood there breathing, trying to recalibrate his senses. The world above continued as if nothing had changed. The cattle troughs sat empty. The wind stirred dust against the fence line. A hawk circled lazily overhead, unconcerned. Elias crossed the porch and went into the kitchen. The table was still littered with mail, the bank's name visible on one of the unopened envelopes. He brushed past it and opened a drawer where he kept heavy work gloves and a few tools. His hand hovered over the phone, then withdrew. He would call later, he told himself, when he had something clearer to report than a wall of ice. He needed proof, understanding. He needed to see the source with his own eyes. From the shed out back, he retrieved the sledgehammer. It was old, the handle darkened by years of sweat and weather, the head nicked and worn. He had used it for fence posts, stubborn stones, the occasional desperate repair. It felt heavier than usual in the heat, as if the air itself was thickening around him. He carried it back across the yard, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. In the doorway to the basement, he paused again, listening to that faint, unnatural pull of cold. It rose to meet him like a warning. His rational mind told him to stop here, to turn around and make the call. But another part of him, something shaped by family stubbornness and long seasons of making do, pressed him forward. He descended into the cellar, the temperature dropping with each step until his skin tightened. The light bulb flickered again when he pulled the chain, and the ice on the wall seemed brighter now, as if it had absorbed the pale glow. Elias walked toward it, gripping the sledgehammer in both hands. Up close, he noticed that the sheet had thickened along the center. The surface there looked as if it had been built in layers, each one pressed onto the last. The veins in the ice were more pronounced, and in the deepest cracks there was a faint bluish tint, a color he had only ever seen in pictures of glaciers. He swallowed, feeling the absurdity of the comparison, and lifted the hammer. The first blow landed with a muffled thud that surprised him. He had expected a sharp crack, the brittle shatter of ice. Instead, the sheet absorbed the impact like dense, packed snow, vibrating the hammer handle up into his wrists. Tiny fragments flew, stinging his cheeks. A shallow dent appeared where the head had struck, and from the edges of that dent thin cracks spidered outward, creeping across the wall in branching lines. He hit again, harder. The noise filled the basement, reverberating off concrete and wood. The dent deepened, and the cracks widened into jagged fissures. Frost dust filled the air. Each exhale from his mouth turned white. His wrapped hand began to ache in a slow, throbbing pulse, as if it resented being this close to the cold. As he worked, a strange sensation grew in his chest. The basement seemed to respond to the blows, not just with echoes, but with a subtle change in the cold itself, as if something behind the wall was being disturbed. The faint hiss he had heard earlier returned, a whisper that rose and fell with the rhythm of his strikes. Once he thought he heard a deeper sound beneath it, a dull, distant groan like metal under pressure. The more he chipped away, the clearer it became that the ice was only part of the problem. Beneath the outer layer, the concrete itself looked wrong. Where the ice broke away, the foundation surface was pitted and flaky, as if it had been stressed beyond its limits. The mortar in the old masonry crumbled when he scraped it with the hammer's edge. It was as though the cold had crept into the wall and rewritten its structure, turning solid stone into something weak and brittle. Sweat ran down his temples and froze at the edges of his hairline. His arms burned with exertion, a strange mix of heat from work and chill from the air. The contrast made him feel dizzy. He forced himself to slow down, to control the blows, widening the fractured section rather than blindly pounding. The last thing he needed was a collapse. After what felt like an hour, but might have been 10 minutes, he saw a change. One of the deeper fissures in the ice opened suddenly, not with a crack, but with a small shift, as if the wall behind it had moved. A thin line of darkness appeared behind the broken layers, a slit where no darkness should be. The cold that poured from it was immediate and brutal. It struck his face and made his eyes water. Elias stepped back, chest heaving. He stared at that narrow gap as if it were an eye staring back. The basement around him felt smaller, tighter, and the cold seemed to pulse from the opening with an intent that unnerved him. He raised the hammer once more, aimed at the weakened area around the gap, and brought it down with all the strength left in his shoulders. The ice shattered wider. The concrete behind it crumbled, not in chunks, but in a sudden spill of powder and broken stone. Something gave way with a hollow, sucking sound, and a section of the wall collapsed inward. For an instant, there was nothing but darkness and the roar of cold air rushing out. The temperature in the basement dropped another notch, fast enough that the exposed metal of a nearby shelf flashed with frost. Elias staggered back, almost losing his balance. Then his flashlight beam, which had fallen sideways during the collapse, caught the edge of what lay beyond. Not dirt, not packed earth or rocks, not anything nature would have placed behind a foundation wall. It was empty space, a cavity large enough to swallow the beam, and within that void, half revealed by the trembling light, something metallic waited, fixed in the earth like the corner of a buried machine. Elias swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry despite the cold. The gap behind his wall led into somewhere that was not supposed to exist, and whatever was down there had been breathing winter into his house for reasons he could not yet understand. Elias stood motionless in the aftermath of the collapse, his heart pounding so hard that it seemed louder than the rushing cold. The broken wall exhaled a continuous stream of frigid air, not in bursts now, but in a steady flow that filled the basement like an invisible tide. The temperature plummeted so quickly that the sweat on his skin stiffened into a tacky film, and the hairs on his arms glittered faintly as frost claimed them. He bent to retrieve the flashlight, his fingers clumsy in their thick gloves, and trained the beam into the opening he had made. The gap was jagged, its edges lined with shattered concrete and torn ice, but beyond that wound the light revealed nothing of the soil he had expected to see. Instead, it shone upon a smooth, curved surface of metal, dull gray and marked by rivets set in precise intervals. The curvature suggested something massive, something built with intention rather than the crude utility of a ranch foundation. Elias felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. His house, the simple place his grandfather had raised with sweat and stubbornness, was leaning against a structure that did not belong to any story he had ever heard. He edged closer to the opening, careful not to disturb the unstable edges of the wall. The cold intensified with proximity, stinging his eyes and forcing him to squint. The hiss he had heard earlier was louder here, a faint but persistent sound like a giant breathing in its sleep. He angled the flashlight to sweep along the visible section of metal and saw that it extended both upward and downward, disappearing into shadow in both directions. The scale of it was impossible to judge from the fragment he could see, but his instincts whispered that it was large, larger than anything a farmer would ever need or afford. With the hammer, he pried at the crumbling masonry around the breach, widening it inch by inch. Each small success sent another gust of icy air washing over him, and the basement answered with new noises. The ceiling timbers creaked, reacting to stresses he could not see. Somewhere deeper in the wall, something shifted with a muffled groan that resonated through the foundation. It was not the sharp sound of breaking stone, but the deeper complaint of material that had been forced beyond its limits. When the opening was wide enough for him to crouch and lean inside, he hesitated. The rational voice that had been drowned out by urgency now tried to claw its way back. This was dangerous, it said. You do not know what this is or what it contains. The bank letters on the kitchen table, the empty corrals, the dead pump upstairs all conspired against that voice. He needed to know what he was up against, even if that knowledge came at a price. He lowered himself carefully, bracing one knee against the broken edge of the foundation and pushing the flashlight into the cavity. The beam cut a narrow path through darkness and revealed more metal, not just a single curved surface, but a complex arrangement of panels, seams, and conduits. Thick pipes ran along the wall of the void, their surfaces coated in a crust of white frost that flaked away in slow motion as the cold air streamed past. Bundles of cables were fixed in place by brackets, their insulation cracked with age. Everything looked old, abandoned, but not dead. The cold was proof of that. The space behind the wall was larger than he had dared to imagine. It was not a simple hollow left by erosion or a poorly filled trench. It was a chamber, or perhaps a corridor, cut into the earth and then forgotten. His house, he realized, was not simply built on land. It was built over something. He wriggled his shoulders through the breach until half his body was inside the hidden cavity. The floor beneath him was not soil, but a slab of concrete, colder than the basement floor had ever been, as if it were drawing warmth from him with deliberate intent. The beam of the flashlight revealed a vertical support column to his left, its base disappearing into the slab, its upper reaches fading into darkness. To his right, the metal wall curved away, and along it ran a series of thick, insulated lines that he recognized, dimly, from pictures he had seen in old magazines. They looked like refrigeration pipes, the kind used in industrial freezers, not the delicate coils behind a kitchen fridge, but massive arteries designed to move cold at scale. The sound that had haunted him from the basement wall resolved itself here into something clearer. It was the faint, continuous hum of machinery, so low it hovered at the edge of hearing. He pressed his ear closer to the metal and felt it vibrate almost imperceptibly. Whatever this was, some part of it was still alive. Elias pulled back from the opening, lungs burning from air that felt too thin and too sharp to sustain him for long. He leaned against the opposite wall of the basement and closed his eyes. His house groaned around him, reacting to the disturbance like an old animal roused from sleep. The contrast between the heat he had left upstairs and the unnatural cold that now dominated his cellar made him feel as if he were straddling two incompatible worlds, neither of which he fully belonged to anymore. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to catalog what he had seen. Pipes, cables, metal walls, concrete floors. This was not a cave. It was a facility. The word felt heavy in his mind, bringing with it images of warning signs, locked doors, and men in uniforms who spoke in acronyms. He had lived his entire life in the open, under a sky that stretched unbroken for miles. The idea that something secretive and enclosed lay under his feet made him feel like an intruder in his own home. The cold was spreading, that much was undeniable. Frost now traced the edges of the old workbench near the wall, outlining its shape in ghostly white. The air in the basement was turning dense, almost wet with cold, and when he inhaled too deeply, his chest tightened in protest. He could not leave this unattended. Even if he filled the hole, even if he ignored it, the ice would keep coming. It would not respect the boundaries of his fear or his finances. He glanced at the pump again, its problem now trivial compared to the nightmare unfolding behind him. The water could wait. The house could not. The realization that the foundation itself was being undermined sent a fresh wave of panic through him. If the wall gave way completely, if the hidden structure collapsed or shifted, it could take half the house with it. He imagined the living room floor sagging, the ceiling beams twisting, the ranch's last refuge crumpling into the void. There was a temptation, wild and irrational, to see this as an opportunity rather than a threat. For years he had prayed for something to change, for something to break the pattern of slow decline. Now something had indeed broken through, but not in the way he had hoped. Still, a part of him wondered what such a structure might be worth, what secrets it might hold. That thought was chased away almost as soon as it formed. The cold burned his skin through the gloves. Whatever lay behind that wall was not a gift. It was a liability. He climbed the stairs again, more slowly this time, pausing at the top to let the heat wash over him. It felt obscene now, almost violent, the way the sun baked the porch and the yard beyond. He looked out across the ranch with new eyes, seeing not just drought and debt, but fragility. Beneath that dust lay something that could unmake everything he had left. He reached for his phone in the kitchen, then stopped. What would he say? That he had found a hidden industrial structure under his house that was pumping cold into his foundation. The words sounded like the start of a joke or the end of a man's credibility. He needed more than shock to make this real to anyone else. He needed proof, documentation, context. He needed to understand what he had uncovered before he invited the world into his basement. The rest of the afternoon blurred into a cycle of cautious investigation. He returned to the breach with a measuring tape and tried to gauge the size of the opening, the thickness of the ice, the dimensions of the metal wall beyond. Each time he leaned inside, the cold bit harder and the hum of machinery seemed louder, as if aware of his presence. He noticed a faint chemical smell as well, something sharp and synthetic that did not belong to soil or stone. It lingered in the back of his throat long after he retreated to the warmer air. By evening, the sun had begun to sink, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The desert cooled as it always did after dusk, but the basement did not. The ice glowed faintly in the dim light, a pale monument to whatever was happening beneath his home. The cracks in the foundation were wider now, easy to trace with a finger. The faint hiss had grown into a steady, unsettling whisper that seemed to carry from the wall to every corner of the cellar. Elias stood at the top of the basement stairs and watched the cold spill upward in slow, invisible waves. He thought of his grandfather again, of the stories about building this house, about trusting the land to hold steady. The land had been honest with them then. It had not hidden anything. Now it concealed a buried machine that was tearing that honesty apart from below. He could not sleep that night. Each creak of the house sounded like a prelude to collapse. Each gust of wind against the siding felt like pressure on an already wounded structure. Sometime near dawn he made his decision, not with words, but with a sense of finality that settled in his chest. This was beyond him now. The discovery had crossed a line where pride and thrift could no longer protect him. As the first light of morning crept across the ranch, he picked up his phone and began to search for answers that were not written in bank letters or remembered in family stories. Whatever lay under his house had a history, and he intended to uncover it before it buried everything he had left. Morning came with no mercy. The desert did not care that Elias had not slept, did not care that his house was being hollowed out by something that had no right to exist. The sun climbed above the low hills and poured its heat across the ranch as it always did, baking the dust, bleaching the boards of the porch, turning every shadow into a thin, fragile refuge. From the outside, the house looked unchanged, an aging farmhouse crouched in a field of exhaustion, unaware that beneath its north wall an alien winter was breathing. Elias stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, listening to the distant hum that now haunted him even when he was not in the basement. He did not know whether the sound was real or whether his mind had learned its rhythm and could not let it go. Every creak of the floorboards under his boots felt amplified, as though the house itself were warning him that it was no longer a safe place to stand. He went back down the stairs, moving more slowly than the day before, his body protesting the lack of rest. The air changed as he descended, heat giving way to an uneasy neutrality, and then to the same brutal cold that had greeted him last night. The ice sheet on the wall had thickened, its edges creeping farther along the concrete, claiming new territory. Frost had spread across the nearest shelf, turning the metal tools into pale silhouettes against the dark. The breach he had made gaped wider now, the surrounding masonry weakened by the cold. He did not need to widen it further to slip inside. He set the flashlight beam through the opening and took a breath that scraped his throat raw. Then he leaned in and crossed the threshold, leaving his basement behind as if stepping into a different century. The hidden space swallowed him. The concrete slab beneath his boots felt as cold as iron, leaching warmth through the soles until his toes began to ache. The metal wall he had glimpsed the night before loomed to his left, curving gently upward and out of sight. Its surface was scarred by decades of condensation and corrosion, yet the lines of its construction were clean and precise, as if it had been built by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and why. He swept the light around and discovered that the cavity was not a simple pocket, but part of a larger arrangement. The concrete floor extended in a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the wall, disappearing into darkness in both directions. Thick pipes ran along the ceiling, insulated with material that had cracked and split over time, revealing a darker core beneath. From these fissures seeped a white crust that looked like frozen residue, clinging to the metal like the aftermath of a chemical snowfall. The smell was stronger here. It was not the earthy scent of soil or the moldy dampness of forgotten spaces. It was sharp, sterile, tinged with something faintly sweet that made his stomach churn. He had smelled something like it once before, in a hospital corridor when his mother had been dying, the scent of chemicals that promised healing and delivered none. The hum he had heard resolved itself into a layered soundscape now that he was closer to its source. There was the faint vibration in the metal, the low-frequency throb of machinery working somewhere beyond sight, and, beneath that, an intermittent click like a relay engaging and disengaging. It was a heartbeat, mechanical and indifferent, keeping time in a place that was never meant to be forgotten. He followed the corridor to the right, the beam of the flashlight dancing over details that filled him with a growing sense of unease. There were doors set into the metal wall at regular intervals, each one outlined by thick rubber seals that had hardened with age. Their handles were recessed, industrial in design, and some bore remnants of stenciled markings that had long since faded into illegibility. He brushed his gloved hand over one and felt the cold bite through the leather as if the door itself were alive with it. At the end of the corridor, the space widened into a chamber large enough that the beam could not reach its far wall. The ceiling rose higher here, supported by steel beams that intersected in a grid pattern overhead. More pipes converged in this room, feeding into a cluster of machinery that dominated the center. Elias approached cautiously, heart pounding in his ears. The machine was enormous, a tangle of compressors, pressure vessels, and control panels fused into a single, monstrous unit. It was coated in frost and grime, yet parts of it gleamed faintly where the ice had not yet claimed them. Dials were frozen in place, needles locked at numbers he could not read. A row of indicator lights along one side glowed dimly, stubbornly alive, despite the decades that must have passed since anyone last cared for them. He stared at the lights, feeling a strange mix of awe and terror. This was not a ruin in the usual sense. Ruins were silent, inert, monuments to what had been lost. This thing was still working, still pushing cold through its arteries, still shaping the environment around it. It was a buried organ in the body of the land, pumping winter where no winter should be. As he circled the machinery, his flashlight picked out details that made his skin crawl. Warning labels peeled from the metal, their colors dulled but their shapes unmistakable. Hazard symbols that had once shouted in red and black now whispered in faded ghosts. He recognized enough to know that whatever substances had once flowed through these pipes were not meant to leak into the soil, not meant to touch human skin or the bones of a farmhouse. A metallic creak echoed from somewhere overhead, sharp and brief, and he flinched, scanning the ceiling for movement. The beams were coated in a film of ice where condensation had frozen, and he could see tiny droplets forming even now, the cold forcing moisture from the air. Each drop fell and shattered on the floor with a sound so small it was almost imagined. The enormity of the situation pressed in on him. This was not a forgotten cellar or a collapsed well. This was infrastructure, the kind built for a purpose larger than any one man's life. He felt like an ant crawling through the arteries of a buried giant. His grandfather had raised a house here without ever knowing what lay beneath, trusting the ground to be what it had always been. The betrayal of that trust was almost personal. Elias leaned against a support column to steady himself. The cold radiated through the concrete into his spine, and for a moment he thought he might black out. He closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe shallowly, aware that the air here might carry more than just cold. When he opened them again, his gaze was drawn to a bundle of cables that snaked away from the machinery and disappeared into a sealed conduit in the far wall. The conduit was labeled, though the words were half obliterated by corrosion. He could make out fragments that suggested power, control, something about redundancy. He followed the conduit with the flashlight until it vanished into darkness beyond the reach of the beam. The implication was clear enough without a map. This complex extended far beyond the small section he had uncovered. It was not a single room or a forgotten device. It was a network, a system buried under his ranch, waiting for a trigger it had finally found. A distant groan rolled through the structure, deeper than any sound he had heard yet. It vibrated through the soles of his boots and into his bones. He imagined the underground chambers shifting, the frozen soil expanding and contracting, the foundation of his house caught between the heat above and the cold below like flesh in a vise. He backed away from the machinery, the weight of what he had seen bearing down on him. The fantasy that this discovery might save him evaporated, replaced by a grim certainty. This was not a resource. It was a hazard, a mistake from another era that had outlived the people who made it and now threatened to take his life's work with it. When he emerged from the cavity back into his basement, the change in temperature felt like moving from Arctic night into early winter. The cellar was still cold, still hostile, but it no longer held the raw, alien intensity of the hidden space. He turned and looked at the breach in the wall, at the ice creeping outward like a slow, deliberate tide, and felt a wave of helplessness crash over him. He climbed the stairs in a daze, every step a reminder that the ground he trusted was no longer solid. In the kitchen, he leaned heavily on the counter, staring at the phone he had left there the night before. The search for answers he had promised himself could not wait any longer. Whatever this buried machine was, it had a history, and that history was the only weapon he had left against it. As he dialed the number for the county archives, his hand shook, not from cold now, but from the realization that his house, his ranch, and perhaps his future were built on a lie that had waited half a century to be told. The woman at the county archives spoke with the practiced patience of someone who had spent years explaining to people that history was not kept in neat drawers waiting to be handed over on demand. Elias listened to her voice through the cheap speaker of his phone while standing at the kitchen counter, the window behind him framing a desert that looked as indifferent as ever to the turmoil beneath his floorboards. He gave her his name, the address of the ranch, and the bare outline of his problem, leaving out the more unbelievable details until he could decide whether to trust her with them. She told him the public terminal was available that afternoon. It was not far, only 30 miles to the small county seat where the old courthouse stood like a tired sentinel in a town that had long since been passed by the modern world. Elias hung up, gathered the folder of papers he had kept from his father's time, and drove away from the ranch with a knot in his stomach that tightened with every mile. The archive room smelled of dust and disinfectant, a blend that seemed designed to sterilize memory itself. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he took a seat at a computer that had not been upgraded in years. He typed in the property number and watched the screen populate with fragments of the past, deeds and transfers that traced the land's journey from one owner to the next. The names meant little to him at first, a litany of strangers, until he saw his grandfather's signature on a scanned document dated more than 60 years ago. That was where the story began to change. The sale price was low, even by the standards of the time, and the accompanying notes were vague in a way that set his nerves on edge. He clicked through to related files, finding references to infrastructure remediation and structural anomalies that had been flagged and then apparently resolved. There were no photographs attached, no blueprints that explained what those phrases meant. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the details, leaving only the barest outline of a problem that no one wanted to remember. He dug deeper, following cross-references into old planning commission minutes and municipal reports. In the early 1960s, the town that now served only as a waypoint on the highway had been something else entirely. It had been slated for expansion, buoyed by federal funding and Cold War paranoia. The documents spoke in careful bureaucratic language about food security and emergency preparedness, about the need for decentralized storage facilities that could operate independent of the surface world in the event of catastrophe. There were code names he did not recognize, project titles that hinted at secrecy without explaining it. The further back he went, the stranger it became. One report mentioned the construction of a subterranean refrigeration complex designed to house strategic reserves of medical supplies and perishables. It was described in glowing terms, a marvel of modern engineering, capable of maintaining sub-zero temperatures indefinitely through redundant systems and autonomous power generation. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he read, the words on the screen aligning with the images burned into his mind of frost-coated pipes and humming machinery. Then the tone of the records shifted. There were references to structural failures, to unexpected subsidence in the surrounding soil. A newspaper clipping scanned into the system mentioned a grocery store that had once stood on the site now occupied by his ranch, a modern building for its time, with a walk-in freezer that had been the pride of the neighborhood. The clipping was short and vague, reporting that the store had been closed after inspectors found serious deficiencies in its foundation. The next entry in the archive was a condemnation order, followed by a note that demolition had been carried out to prevent hazards to the street above. Elias stared at the screen, his pulse loud in his ears. There was no mention of dismantling the refrigeration system, no detailed account of what had been done with the subterranean components of the building. The records jumped forward several months to a land transfer that handed the now empty lot to a private seller at a steep discount. His grandfather's name appeared again a few pages later. He leaned back in his chair, the fluorescent light making his eyes ache. The pieces began to fit together with a horrible clarity. The grocery store's freezer had not been removed. It had been entombed, buried hastily along with whatever experimental infrastructure had been built beneath it, sealed away to save money and avoid embarrassment. Over time, the land had been sold, the memory of what lay beneath it fading as surely as the ink on the old forms. His family had built their home over a forgotten machine that was never truly turned off. The woman from the front desk approached, her shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. She asked if he had found what he was looking for. Elias hesitated, then nodded, though the truth was that he had found far more than he had bargained for. He thanked her and gathered his papers, his hands trembling despite the warmth of the room. On the drive back to the ranch, he could not escape the images the records had conjured. He pictured men in hard hats lowering machinery into the earth, sealing it away with concrete and paperwork, trusting that time would erase their shortcuts. He imagined his grandfather arriving years later, seeing only an empty lot and an opportunity to build a life. The betrayal was not just technical, it was moral. Someone had chosen convenience over responsibility, and the cost of that choice was coming due now with interest. When he returned home, the house greeted him with the same quiet that had felt oppressive since the ice had appeared. He descended into the basement with the folder tucked under his arm like a shield. The cold had intensified again in his absence. The ice sheet had crept another inch along the wall, its surface now marred by new cracks that branched like lightning. The faint chemical smell was stronger, stinging his nostrils. He stood before the breach and looked through into the hidden space beyond, armed now with the knowledge of what it likely was. Strategic refrigeration, the records had said, a subterranean freezer meant to outlast the end of the world. It had outlasted its creators, all right. Now it was tearing apart the foundation of a house built by men who had never been told the truth. He reached into the folder and pulled out the newspaper clipping he had printed at the archive. The photograph that accompanied it showed the grocery store as it had once been, a cheerful brick building with large windows and a sign promising fresh produce. Nothing in that image hinted at the danger that lay beneath, at the system that would one day wake up and begin to poison the ground around it with cold. The basement groaned around him, a long, low sound that made him flinch. He could feel the chill rising higher now, brushing the underside of the floor above. It was no longer a localized problem. It was spreading, reaching upward as well as outward. The words from the records echoed in his mind, phrases about chemical refrigerants and autonomous systems. If those pipes were leaking, if whatever fluid had been used to keep the complex cold was seeping into the soil, then the danger was not limited to cracked concrete. It could be a contamination, a hazard that no amount of patching could fix. Elias climbed back to the kitchen and set the folder on the table among the unopened bank letters. For the first time in years, the threat they represented felt secondary. He dialed the number for the fire department, his finger hovering for a moment over the final digit. He had always prided himself on handling his own problems, on not involving authorities unless there was no other choice. That illusion had died somewhere between the ice on his basement wall and the records in the county archive. When the dispatcher answered, he told her about the cold in his basement, about the hidden structure he had uncovered, about the documents he had found. He did not dramatize it, did not reach for words like catastrophe or disaster. He simply stated the facts as best he could, trusting that the truth was alarming enough on its own. After he hung up, the house seemed to hold its breath. The desert outside went on with its business, the sun lowering toward the horizon, the heat slowly easing its grip. Inside, the cold waited, patient and implacable, a relic of a buried past that had finally remembered how to assert itself. The first engine from the volunteer fire department arrived before sunset, its red paint blazing like a flare against the pale dust of the ranch road. Two more followed, raising a plume that drifted across the field and settled in the empty corrals. Elias watched them from the porch, the folder from the county archive still clutched in his hand, as men in turnout coats stepped down and took in the scene with expressions that shifted from routine to wary the moment they felt the unnatural chill seeping from the open basement door. They did not rush in at first. They walked the perimeter of the house, palms pressed against siding that felt wrong even in the evening air. One of them crouched at the north wall and brushed his fingers through soil that had hardened to the texture of stone. Another shook his head slowly and muttered something Elias could not hear. The desert was cooling now as it always did, but the cold around the house was deeper, sharper, and it spread outward in a way that defied everything they expected of this place. Inside, the basement was no longer merely cold. The ice sheet had thickened and darkened, its veins more pronounced, as if something beneath it were forcing its way through the wall. The firefighters brought in a handheld sensor that chirped and flickered when they passed it through the breach, its readings climbing in ways that made them exchange uneasy glances. They were not chemists, but they knew enough to recognize danger when a device refused to behave like it should. The ground around the house was beginning to show signs of distress. Hairline cracks snaked across the hard-packed dirt near the foundation, radiating outward in shallow arcs. In one spot, a shallow depression had formed, the soil sinking almost imperceptibly under the weight of the invisible cold. Elias stood with his arms wrapped around himself, watching his ranch betray him inch by inch. A truck from the county arrived with two men in reflective vests who introduced themselves as environmental response specialists. They spoke in cautious terms about potential contamination, about unknown substances that could be involved in refrigeration systems of that era. They asked for the documents Elias had retrieved, scanned them, and then fell silent as they read. One of them ran a gloved hand through his hair and looked at the basement entrance as if it were a mouth that might bite. By nightfall, the house had been cordoned off. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a flimsy barrier that nonetheless transformed the place into something foreign. Elias was allowed to go inside only under supervision, and only long enough to gather essentials. Each step he took across the living room floor made him flinch, half expecting the boards to give way beneath him. The walls were already showing new fractures, thin as pencil lines but multiplying with each passing hour. He carried boxes out to his pickup in a daze. Photographs, his grandfather's old tools, the battered Bible that had sat on the mantel for as long as he could remember. He left behind furniture, dishes, clothes, things he had once thought indispensable, but now seemed like ballast on a sinking ship. Every trip through the front door felt like an intrusion, as if the house were no longer his to claim. The specialists returned to the basement with heavier equipment and came back with worse news. The ground beneath the foundation was freezing at a rate that suggested a sustained leak from the buried system. Whatever refrigerant had been used in the original construction was not staying contained. It was migrating into the soil, altering its structure, turning what should have been supportive earth into something brittle and unstable. They spoke of thermal expansion and contraction, of pressures that could cause sudden subsidence without warning. As if to underscore their point, a low rumble shuddered through the ground beneath their feet. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was enough to make the coffee in Elias's hand slosh against the rim of the cup. One of the firefighters swore softly. A few feet from the north wall, the earth slumped, forming a shallow crater that had not been there moments before. That was when the phrase "dangerous zone" was first spoken aloud. It hung in the air like a sentence being passed. The ranch, the house, the land his family had worked for generations was no longer a home. It was a liability, a hazard to be managed and contained. The words were clinical, but the effect on Elias was visceral. His chest tightened, and he had to fight the urge to run back inside, to stand in the middle of the living room and refuse to leave. They told him the costs involved in remediation would be substantial. Excavation, containment, disposal of contaminated soil, dismantling whatever remained of the buried complex. The numbers were not given in full, but the tone was enough. It would be more than his insurance could ever hope to cover, more than the value of the land itself. The ranch had not been worth much before this discovery. Now it was worth nothing at all. As the night deepened, floodlights were set up around the house, casting harsh shadows across the yard. The ice in the basement glowed faintly in their glare, a pale monolith that seemed to mock the desert stars above. Elias sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched strangers move through the space that had once been his private world. They spoke in technical terms he barely followed, but he caught enough to know that the problem was growing, not stabilizing. Sleep was impossible. He drifted between the cab of his truck and the edge of the taped-off yard, unable to tear his eyes from the house. Each time he thought he heard a new crack or groan, his heart jumped into his throat. The idea that the place could collapse without warning haunted him, a specter more frightening than any dead. At dawn, when the desert was at its briefest mercy, the specialists returned with new equipment and grim faces. Overnight, the frozen zone beneath the house had expanded. The readings they took showed a steady spread, the cold moving through the soil like a slow infection. One of them explained that the interplay between the surface heat and the subterranean freeze was creating stress patterns no one had planned for. It was not just the foundation at risk now, but the surrounding land as well. They told him he would have to leave. Not eventually, not after a few days, but now. The area was being designated unsafe, and no one without protective equipment would be allowed inside. Elias nodded, a gesture automatic, as if his body were moving on instructions his mind had not yet processed. He walked to the front door for what he suspected might be the last time, and looked back at the rooms where his life had unfolded. The morning light slanted across the kitchen table, illuminating the pile of bank letters he had never opened. He almost laughed at the irony. The truck was loaded with what little he had managed to save. As he drove away, slowly, past the tape and the men in reflective vests, he saw that the north side of the house was already sagging. It was subtle, something an outsider might miss, but to Elias it was unmistakable. The ranch was beginning to die, not from drought or debt, but from a secret buried long before he was born. He pulled over at the end of the dirt road and looked back one last time before the turn that would hide the house from view. The desert lay beyond it, vast and uncaring, a place where history sank into the ground and waited. His phone buzzed with a message from the insurance company, a reminder of a world that no longer applied to him. He turned it off and rested his forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the weight of everything he was losing settle over him like a second, invisible winter. Elias spent the next 2 days in a motel on the edge of town, a place that smelled faintly of bleach and burnt coffee and had walls thin enough to let every stranger's footsteps leak into his sleep. He had not planned to stay there. The idea of being away from the ranch, even for a night, had always filled him with an unease he could not name, as though the land might forget him if he left it unattended. Now he had no choice, and the absence felt like a hollowing out rather than a rest. The official notice arrived on the third morning, slid under the door in a plain envelope that carried no sense of the upheaval it represented. It informed him that his property had been classified as an environmental hazard, pending further assessment and remediation, that access would be restricted, that he was to refrain from attempting any repairs or removal of materials without authorization. The language was crisp and impersonal, every sentence ending in a period that felt like a door closing. He drove back toward the ranch anyway, stopping at the roadblock that had been erected where the dirt track met the county highway. The same yellow tape fluttered there, now joined by a temporary sign warning of hazardous conditions. A deputy recognized him from the first night and approached with a look that was meant to be sympathetic. He told Elias that he could not go any farther, that specialists were working, that it was for his own safety. Elias nodded and stared past him at the line of floodlights still ringing his house, their beams faint in the daylight like ghosts of urgency. He returned to the motel and spread the contents of the folder from the archives across the bed. The papers no longer felt like evidence. They felt like accusations. He read them again, searching for any clause, any forgotten footnote that might suggest a way out, some acknowledgement of responsibility on the part of the city or the state. There was nothing. The project had been closed, the store condemned, the land sold. The rest was silence, a bureaucratic void in which blame had been swallowed by time. The phone calls began that afternoon. Insurance first, their voice calm and professional as they explained that his policy did not cover environmental contamination originating from pre-existing conditions. Then the bank, their tone more strained now, as if the news from the county had shifted him from debtor to liability. They spoke of outstanding balances, of options he no longer had, of the inevitability of foreclosure. Elias listened, his responses reduced to monosyllables, feeling as though he were shrinking with each word they spoke. By evening, he found himself driving aimlessly through the town, past the courthouse, past the shuttered grocery stores and vacant lots that told the same story his ranch now embodied. This place had once been poised for growth, for a future that had been promised and then quietly withdrawn. The buried complex under his house was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a pattern that had left ruins in its wake, only most of them were visible above ground. On the fourth day, he was summoned to a meeting at the county offices. The room was small and windowless, the air stale, as if it had been sealed off from the world like the facility under his land. The environmental specialists were there, along with a representative from the county and a woman from a firm he did not recognize. They spoke in turn, outlining the findings so far, the scope of the problem, the likely need for extensive excavation and soil removal. The costs were finally mentioned in full, numbers that made his stomach clench. Even if he sold everything he owned, even if he emptied every account he had, it would not begin to cover them. The woman from the firm explained that her company specialized in handling properties in situations like this, that they could facilitate a transfer of ownership that would relieve him of further liability. The words were chosen carefully, but the meaning was blunt. He could walk away now, leave the ranch behind, and let the system absorb what remained of it. Elias stared at the tabletop while they spoke, tracing the pattern in the laminate with his eyes. He thought of his grandfather's hands, cracked and strong, resting on that same land. He thought of his father teaching him to drive along the dirt road, the engine of the old truck sputtering in protest. None of that had prepared him for a moment like this, where history and loyalty were weighed against the cold arithmetic of hazard and expense. He did not argue. He did not ask for time. He signed the papers when they were slid across to him, his name looking foreign in the blank spaces provided. The act felt less like a decision and more like the acknowledgement of something that had already happened. The ranch was gone. It had been gone the moment he struck the wall in his basement and opened a door into the past. After the meeting, he returned to the roadblock once more, driven by a need he could not articulate. The deputy was still there, leaning against his cruiser, and he waved Elias through this time with a nod that suggested understanding. The floodlights had been turned off, but the house was still encircled by equipment and temporary fencing. From a distance, it looked smaller, diminished, as if the land itself were already reclaiming it. Elias parked on the shoulder and walked as far as he was allowed. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the outline of the place that had defined him for most of his life. The north wall was no longer straight. It bowed inward in a way that made his chest ache. He imagined the ice spreading unseen beneath the floors, the buried machine still humming its indifferent song. Memories crowded in, unbidden. His grandmother hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets snapping in the wind. His father repairing a fence in the fading light, calling him over to hold the wire steady. Even the hard times took on a strange glow in retrospect, transformed by the knowledge that there would be no more. He turned away before the deputy could tell him it was time to leave. Back in the car, he rested his head against the steering wheel and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the past press against him like the cold that had once filled his basement. He had not just lost a house. He had lost the physical anchor of his family's story, the place where their efforts had been recorded in wood and earth. That night, alone in the motel room, he lay awake listening to the traffic outside and wondered how something so large, so dangerous, could have been buried and forgotten. The ranch had seemed like a victim of bad luck and bad markets. Now, he saw it as collateral damage in a chain of decisions made by people who had never imagined the consequences would land on someone like him. The thought left him hollow, a man adrift between a past he could no longer reach and a future he had not yet imagined. Elias returned to the ranch at dawn on the 5th day, guided through the cordon by a young technician who carried a clipboard like a shield. The desert was at its most deceptive hour, the sky washed clean of night, the air still cool enough to suggest mercy. For a moment, as he walked toward the house that was no longer his, he could almost pretend that nothing had happened, that the past week had been a fever dream from which he was about to wake. Then the cold reached him, a breath of winter sliding across the dust, and the illusion shattered. The front door groaned when he pushed it open, a familiar sound that felt suddenly precious. He stepped inside with the careful reverence of a man entering a chapel, knowing this would be the last time he did so. The living room was bare of most of the things he had once taken for granted. The spaces where furniture had stood were outlined in paler patches on the floor, the ghosts of ordinary days. Sunlight filtered through the curtains and illuminated motes of dust that drifted slowly, indifferent to the danger beneath them. He moved from room to room, touching walls, door frames, the edge of the kitchen counter, committing textures to memory as if they might be all he had left. In the bedroom, he paused by the window that looked out toward the north field, the land that had been hardest to work and that he had always saved for last when hope was thin. The earth out there was still deceptively whole, but he knew what lay beneath it now, knew that it was being hollowed and frozen by a machine that had never cared about crops or families. The stairs to the basement were roped off, but the technician cut the tape and stood aside. The air changed instantly, the warmth of the house giving way to the raw chill below. Elias descended slowly, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The basement no longer looked like a place meant for storage and forgotten projects. It had become a threshold, an entrance to something that belonged to another era and another set of priorities. The ice had claimed most of the north wall now, a single, towering sheet that gleamed faintly even in the low light. It extended outward along the ceiling beams, fingers of frost reaching toward the center of the room. The concrete floor near the breach was slick and uneven, the result of stresses that had warped it from below. Each breath Elias took burned his lungs, the cold sharper than it had ever been. He walked to the place where he had first struck the wall, the jagged opening now reinforced with temporary supports that looked pitifully inadequate against the scale of what lay beyond. Through the gap, he could see the metal skin of the buried complex, coated in a thick rind of ice, the pipes above it glistening like the ribs of some immense, frozen beast. The hum was louder here, not in volume but in presence, a constant reminder that the past was not content to stay buried. He thought of the plan he had been handed the day before, the diagrams and timelines that spelled out how the site would be excavated, how the contaminated soil would be removed and shipped away, how the house would be dismantled piece by piece. It was all so methodical, so precise, as if this were just another project in a long line of projects that the county had learned to manage. There was no place in those documents for grief. Elias reached out and touched the edge of the ice, not with his bare hand this time, but with the leather of his glove. The cold still bit through, but he held it there for a moment, letting the sensation anchor him. This was the wound in his house, the place where everything had gone wrong, but it was also the place where the truth had finally broken through. Without it, he might have spent the rest of his life fighting drought and debt, never knowing that the land beneath him was compromised, that the foundation of his world was literally freezing away. The technician shifted his weight behind him, reminding Elias of the time he had been given. He nodded and turned away from the breach, scanning the basement one last time. The shelves were empty now, the workbench stripped bare, the pump forgotten in the corner like an artifact from a simpler crisis. He imagined his grandfather down here, hammer in hand, measuring twice and cutting once, building something he believed would last. He wondered what the old man would have said if he had known that beneath his efforts lay a relic of a war that never came. Upstairs, the house felt warmer by comparison, though the cold was beginning to creep into the walls there as well. Elias paused in the living room, standing in the exact spot where he had once measured his height against the doorframe as a boy. The pencil marks were still there, faint but legible, a record of growth that had once seemed to promise a future as solid as the wood it was written on. He ran a finger along them, feeling the grooves, and swallowed hard. The technician waited by the door, his expression gentle but firm. It was time. Elias stepped out onto the porch, the morning sun warming his face, and for a moment the contrast between that warmth and the cold behind him was so stark it made him dizzy. He turned back and looked at the house, really looked at it, committing its crooked lines and peeling paint to memory. This was not just a building. It was the container of every version of himself he had ever been. They walked back to the truck together in silence. As Elias climbed into the passenger seat, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the ranch recede behind him, the floodlights and fencing shrinking into the landscape. He felt empty, not in the sense of having nothing left, but in the way a vessel feels when it has finally been relieved of too much weight. The grief was there, deep and aching, but beneath it ran a current of something else, a reluctant relief that the struggle was over, that the fight he had been losing for years had been taken out of his hands. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of heat and dust leading away from a place that would soon exist only in memory. Elias rested his forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed his eyes, carrying with him the sound of the hum beneath his house, the feel of ice under his glove, the echo of his grandfather's hammer in his bones. The land would forget him. He knew that now, but he would not forget it. The ranch, with all its failures and secrets, would live on in him, a reminder that sometimes the past does not stay buried, and when it rises, it can take everything with it. If this story kept you on edge until the very last moment, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens in the next videos. Watch the rest of the stories on the channel to discover even more shocking secrets hidden in ordinary places. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries just as much as you do.